My name is Abigail Sterling, and at 21 years of age, I have spent exactly 1,156 days living as a ghost within the very house that should have been my sanctuary. The air in the basement of our Victorian estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, always smells of damp concrete, ozone from the industrial wiring, and the cloying chemical scent of oil-based cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks. For over 3 years, my world has been measured in the rhythmic, deafening thud of a 1998 Heidelberg GTO 52 offset press, a machine that requires constant vigilance and a strength I didn't know I possessed until I was forced to find it. My father, Marcus Sterling, a man who prides himself on his collection of bespoke Brioni suits and his seat on the board of several prestigious local charities, would often stand at the top of the basement stairs, his silhouette framed by the warm amber glow of the upstairs hallway, holding a crystal tumbler of Macallan 12-year-old double-cask Highland single malt scotch. He would look down at me, his face twisted into a mask of calculated disappointment, and remind me that my cognitive limitations were the reason I was relegated to this subterranean workshop instead of attending the Ivy League lectures my twin brother, Julian, so casually frequented at Yale. "You are too cognitively limited for higher education, Abigail," he would sneer, the ice cubes clinking against the glass as he swirled the golden liquid. "Just keep the offset press running and be grateful we do not invoice you $850 a month for that basement cell you call a bedroom." I believed him because I had no reason not to, especially after my 18th birthday when my mother, Eleanor, sat me down in the morning room and slid a forged high school failure notice across the polished mahogany table, claiming that my grades had been so abysmal that I hadn't even qualified for a diploma. I was a liability, they told me, a stain on the sterling reputation that could only be washed away through silent, unpaid labor in the family printing business. For 38 months, I have pulled 62-hour weeks, my fingers permanently stained with ink that no amount of industrial-strength hand cleaner can fully remove, producing high-end stationery wedding invitations for the Greenwich elite and annual reports for local hedge funds that charge their clients tens of thousands of dollars in management fees. I earned exactly $0 my only compensation being a cramped room next to the furnace and 3 meals a day that usually consisted of leftovers Julian didn't want. The reality, which I was too broken to see, was that I was the most profitable asset Sterling & Sons Printing ever had. A skilled technician who required no salary, no benefits, and no recognition. The basement temperature was always a steady 64 degrees to prevent the paper stock from curling, a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones as I moved through the repetitive motions of loading the feeder. I would reach for a stack of Mohawk superfine 100-pound cover white eggshell paper, the texture slightly toothy under my calloused fingertips, and carefully align it against the side guides of the press. The machine itself is a behemoth of German engineering, weighing several tons, and when I engage the motor, the sound is a visceral mechanical roar that vibrates through the soles of my $25 New Balance sneakers, which are the only shoes I own and are currently held together by a prayer and a bit of duct tape. I would watch the ink fountain rollers turn, ensuring the duct blades were set with microscopic precision so that the color density remained consistent across a run of 5,000 luxury brochures. Every hour I had to check the pH balance of the fountain solution, making sure the conductivity stayed between 800 and 1,200 microsiemens, a technical task my father insisted I was only capable of doing through rote memorization rather than actual intelligence. The sheer injustice of my existence was highlighted every time Julian returned home for the weekend in his 2024 sapphire blue BMW M4, the engine purring with a predatory confidence as he pulled into the circular driveway. I would hear the heavy thud of his car door and his booming laughter as he recounted stories of crew practice or exclusive fraternity galas at the Maury's Association. Meanwhile, I would be adjusting the pressure on the impression cylinder, my muscles aching from lifting 40-pound boxes of paper, my vision blurred by the flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights that my father refused to replace because he claimed they were an unnecessary overhead expense. One particular Tuesday morning, the humidity in the basement had spiked due to a heavy rainstorm soaking the manicured lawns of our 2-acre property, causing the paper to misfeed and jam the grippers. As I worked to clear the mangled sheets of expensive vellum, a task that required me to reach deep into the grease-coated interior of the Heidelberg, I found a discarded envelope tucked behind a stack of shipping crates. It was an official mailing from the Connecticut Department of Education, addressed to me, but the seal had been clumsily broken and resealed with a thin strip of clear tape. Inside was not the failure notice my mother had brandished 3 years ago, but a transcript that listed me as a straight-A student, a National Merit Scholar, and the recipient of a full-ride academic scholarship to the University of Connecticut School of Engineering. My breath hitched in my throat, the metallic tang of the ink suddenly overwhelming as I realized the magnitude of the betrayal. They hadn't hidden me away because I was a failure. They had imprisoned me because I was too competent to lose. They had stolen my future to bolster their bottom line, saving themselves the 6-figure salary of a master printer while keeping their liability out of the public eye so Julian could shine brighter in the reflected glow of their lies. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, a sensation like a fresh blade cutting through the thick fog of gaslighting that had defined my adult life. I looked at my ink-stained hands, the skin cracked around the knuckles, and then at the press that had been my jailer for over 3,000 hours of unpaid labor. I thought about the real-world costs of my imprisonment. A master press operator in the New York metropolitan area earns approximately $75,000 a year, which meant my father had effectively embezzled nearly $250,000 from his own daughter. My room in the basement, which he threatened to charge me $850 a month for, was a windowless 10 by 12 space that shared a wall with the noisy HVAC system, a space that wouldn't even meet the legal requirements for a rental unit in the town of Greenwich. The Macallan he sipped cost $100 a bottle, and the crystal tumblers were Waterford, retailing at $150 for a set of 2, while I was drinking tap water out of a chipped ceramic mug I'd found in a box of donations. The contrast was a physical weight, a suffocating realization of the psychological cage they had built around me, using nothing but forged paper and cruel words. As the press continued its relentless rhythm, thumping out the invitations for the upcoming Sterling and Sons anniversary gala, an event where my parents would undoubtedly toast to their success and Julian's bright future, I began to plan. I looked at the technical manuals for the Heidelberg, books filled with complex mathematics and engineering schematics that I had mastered in secret, and I realized that the limited Abigail they had created was a fiction that was about to be burned to the ground. I was no longer a ghost. I was the engine that kept their empire running, and for the first time, I understood exactly how to turn the power off. The silence that would follow the shutdown of that press would be the loudest thing they had ever heard, a roar of truth that would strip away the Brioni suits and the Yale degrees until all that was left were the hollow, grasping people who thought they could own a human soul for the price of a basement cell. I reached out and touched the cold steel of the machine, my fingers tracing the serial number plate, and I knew that the next time my father stood at the top of those stairs with his scotch, he wouldn't be looking down at a liability. He would be looking at the woman who was about to invoice him for every second of the life he tried to steal. The realization of my own worth began to radiate outward from my chest, a heat that countered the subterranean chill of the printing floor. I stood amongst the pallets of paper, the 2024 calendars we were pre-printing, and the stacks of corporate letterhead, realizing that every single item in this room was a testament to my skill and their greed. I looked at the clock on the wall, a cheap plastic thing from a big box store that ticked in counterpoint to the press, and I saw that it was 2:14 p.m. In the world upstairs, my mother would be preparing for her afternoon bridge club, perhaps ordering a $60 floral arrangement from the florist on Greenwich Avenue, while I stood here in the shadows covered in the filth of their prosperity. The weight of the injustice was no longer a burden, it was fuel. I was 21, I was an engineer by nature and a printer by force, and I was finally ready to stop being grateful for the crumbs of a life I was already paying for with my blood, sweat, and the years I could never get back. Family, I realized as the ink began to dry on a fresh sheet of paper, isn't the people who share your DNA while they bleed you dry. Family is the truth you hold on to when everyone else is trying to drown you in lies. The suffocating reality of my existence was not measured in milestones or memories, but was instead quantified by the fine, invasive coating of black toner dust that settled into the creases of my palms and the jarring, metallic shriek of a 5:30 a.m. alarm clock that felt like a physical blow to my temple every single morning. I am Abigail Sterling, and while the rest of the world in our affluent corner of Connecticut woke up to the smell of freshly ground artisanal coffee and the quiet hum of central heating, my day began in the damp, lightless belly of our family estate, where I operated a 1998 Heidelberg Speedmaster SM52-4-P offset press, a massive four-color behemoth of German engineering that emitted a constant, sharp scent of industrial ozone, damp paper, and the distinct, bitter fragrance of stolen years. My wardrobe was a pathetic collection of $4 thrifted flannels, usually stained with permanent oil-based inks and frayed at the cuffs from repetitive mechanical labor, and my only means of transportation was a rusted 2009 Trek 7.2 FX hybrid bicycle with a squeaky chain and a mismatched rear tire that I had found discarded in a neighbor's bulk trash pickup. This meager life stood in jarring, grotesque contrast to that of my older brother, Tyler, who at 26 years old occupied a $3,200 a month industrial loft in the heart of downtown Chicago, a space featuring exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline, all fully subsidized by the family business under the guise of an executive relocation expense. While I was scrubbing grease from the impression cylinders of a printing press until my knuckles bled, Tyler was navigating the streets of the Windy City in a 2024 Ibis white Audi A5 Sportback, a vehicle that cost more than I would likely see in a decade of this forced servitude, as he entered his sixth unproductive year of a marketing degree at DePaul University that he clearly never intended to finish. My parents, Robert and Susan Sterling, had constructed a masterful narrative of victimhood to justify my incarceration in the basement, claiming with straight faces and cold eyes that my exhaustive 62-hour-a-week labor was merely a form of debt restructuring to pay them back for the $42,000 they had supposedly wasted on remedial tutors and specialized educational consultants who had tried and failed to fix my supposedly limited cognitive abilities during my teenage years. The physical toll of the work was a constant companion, as the Heidelberg required me to lift 40-pound cartons of Mohawk superfine 100-pound cover paper and meticulously load the feeder trays while ensuring the suction grippers were perfectly aligned to prevent a catastrophic paper jam that would cost hundreds of dollars in wasted stock. Every time I adjusted the ink fountain keys, turning the small steel dials to regulate the flow of Pantone 286 blue or warm red, I felt the heavy weight of the lie they had told me about my own mind, a lie that was reinforced every time my father, Robert, would walk into the workshop wearing a bespoke charcoal suit from Richards of Greenwich and check the production logs with a look of profound boredom. He would ignore the fact that I was maintaining a machine that required the technical precision of a mechanical engineer, instead choosing to focus on a single microscopic speck of hickey on a printed sheet to remind me that my limited intellect made me prone to such careless errors. My mother, Susan, was even more surgical in her cruelty, often bringing her friends from the local garden club down to the basement under the pretense of showing off the family business, only to point me out as a cautionary tale of what happens when a child lacks the drive or the mental capacity to succeed in the real world, all while I stood there in my ink-spattered flannels, smelling of kerosene and mineral spirits. They had managed to convince the entire community, and for a long time, me as well, that I was a liability they were charitably supporting out of the goodness of their hearts, when in reality, I was the silent engine generating the revenue that paid for Tyler's penthouse, his $300 dinners at Alinea, and the sleek, leather-wrapped steering wheel of the Audi he drove through the Gold Coast. The Trek bicycle was my only connection to the outside world, a skeletal frame of aluminum and rust that I rode through the winding, wooded back roads of Greenwich whenever I was given a rare few hours of freedom, the wind biting at my face as I pedaled past estates with manicured lawns and six-car garages. I would see girls my age driving 2024 Range Rovers or BMW convertibles, their hair blowing in the wind as they headed toward the country club or the boutiques on Greenwich Avenue, and I would feel like a relic from a different century, a Victorian workhouse girl trapped in a modern-day gilded cage. The contrast between my life and Tyler's was not just financial, it was a total erasure of my humanity, as my parents had systematically stripped away my confidence by presenting me with forged documents claiming I had failed my high school equivalency exams, ensuring I believed I had nowhere else to go. They spoke of the $42,000 in tutoring fees as if it were a mortgage they were forced to carry, ignoring the fact that the work I performed at Sterling and Sons Printing brought in an average of $15,000 in gross profit every single month. Money that flowed directly into their offshore accounts and Tyler's lifestyle, while I was told I should be grateful for the $850 a month credit they gave me against my supposed debt for the privilege of sleeping in a windowless room next to the industrial boiler. I remember one specific evening when the humidity had caused the paper to swell, making it nearly impossible to maintain the tight registration required for a high-end jewelry catalog we were producing for a client on Fifth Avenue. I spent 12 hours straight under the buzzing, yellowed fluorescent lights, my eyes straining to catch the slight variations in color density through a 10-power linen tester loop, ensuring that the gold foil stamping would align perfectly with the printed borders. My back was a map of knots and tension. My legs ached from standing on the concrete floor in shoes that had long since lost their cushioning, and my lungs felt heavy with the smell of the fountain solution, a mixture of water and alcohol substitutes that always left a metallic tang on the back of my tongue. As I finally finished the run of 10,000 copies and began the grueling process of washing up the press, a task that involved pouring flammable solvents onto the rollers while the machine moved at a slow crawl, hand-wiping the steel cylinders until they shone like mirrors, I heard the muffled sound of laughter from the floor above. It was the sound of a celebration, the clink of fine glassware and the low murmur of sophisticated conversation that suggested my parents were hosting another one of their high-stakes dinner parties. I climbed the basement stairs just far enough to peek through the cracked door, seeing Tyler standing there, looking tan and relaxed in a navy blazer and white linen trousers, holding a glass of vintage Bollinger champagne as he regaled a group of family friends with stories of his imaginary marketing internship. The injustice of it was a physical sensation, a sharp, cold spike driven into the center of my chest as I watched my mother beam with pride at her golden son, the boy who had never worked a day in his life and who considered a 3-hour lecture an exhausting ordeal. She didn't see the daughter who was covered in the very ink that provided the wealth she was currently flaunting. She didn't see the engineer's mind that had just successfully troubleshot a complex mechanical failure on a 26-year-old printing press. She saw only the remedial child she had invented to keep her domestic machinery running smoothly. The realization that I was the one subsidizing Tyler's Chicago loft, his Audi, and his endless, aimless education began to burn through the fog of my exhaustion, transforming my fatigue into a quiet, simmering rage that was as steady as the rhythmic thrum of the Heidelberg. I went back down to my basement cell, the scent of industrial ozone clinging to my skin like a second layer of clothing, and I sat on the edge of my narrow cot, looking at the rusted Trek bicycle leaning against the wall and the stacks of paper that represented my parents' true God. I realized then that they didn't hate me. They simply valued my utility more than my soul, and as long as I continued to believe the lie of my own limitation, I would remain the ghost in their machine, the invisible asset that allowed the Sterling name to shine while I faded into the gray background of the toner dust. The debt they claimed I owed was a fiction, a ledger of lies designed to keep me from ever looking up and seeing that I wasn't the one who was cognitively limited. I was the one who was making their entire world possible, one revolution of the press at a time. I lay back on the thin mattress, the sound of the boiler kicking on and shaking the walls, and I promised myself that the $42,000 they claimed to have lost on me would be the cheapest lesson they ever learned. Because when I finally stopped the press, their entire gilded world would grind to a halt along with it. The tectonic plates of my carefully constructed prison did not just shift. They underwent a violent, irreversible subduction on a Sunday afternoon at precisely 2:14 p.m., a moment marked by the low mechanical hum of the central air conditioning and the oppressive scent of rosemary-crusted prime rib wafting from the kitchen. I am Abigail Sterling, and for over 3 years, I had been the silent, ink-stained ghost of Sterling & Sons printing. But the arrival of my brother Tyler's new fiancée, Brooke, acted as a catalyst that would strip the gold leaf off my parents' carefully curated lies. Brooke was not the typical vacuous socialite my brother usually brought home to impress our mother. She was a 30-year-old senior compliance officer for a Tier 1 fintech firm in Manhattan, a woman whose entire professional existence was built upon the forensic deconstruction of financial anomalies and the cold, hard logic of digital audit trails. As we sat in the formal dining room, surrounded by the heavy silk drapes and the polished silver that my labor in the basement had paid for, my father, Robert, began his usual routine of performative success, bragging loudly about the company's $1.2 million annual revenue while swirling a glass of 2018 Opus 1 Cabernet Sauvignon. He was playing the part of the patriarch, the self-made mogul who had overcome the burden of a cognitively limited daughter, while my mother, Susan, beamed beside him, her neck draped in a $4,000 Van Cleef and Arpels Alhambra necklace that sparkled under the crystal chandelier. Brooke, ever the professional, had her 2023 Space Black MacBook Pro open on the edge of the mahogany table, offering to help clean up their digital audit trail in preparation for a pending 7-figure business loan they were seeking to expand the printing plant. An expansion that would undoubtedly require another 20 hours a week of my unpaid life. The air in the room grew thick and stagnant as Brooke's fingers flew across the backlit keyboard, her eyes scanning the encrypted folders of the Sterling & Sons corporate cloud with the predatory efficiency of a shark, sensing blood in the water. I sat at the far end of the table, still wearing one of my $4 thrifted flannels with a faint smudge of cyan ink behind my left ear, feeling like a colonial-era servant at a modern-day feast, until Brooke suddenly froze, the clicking of her keys stopping with a finality that made the hair on my arms stand up. She adjusted her designer tortoiseshell glasses, squinting at the high-resolution retina display as if she couldn't believe the data manifesting before her. And then she turned her head slowly to look at me, with a look of genuine, haunting confusion that pierced through the layers of gaslighting I had lived under for 38 months. "Abigail," she began, her voice dropping into a professional register that signaled the discovery of a catastrophic irregularity. "Why is your $85,000 Vanguard Education Trust marked as disbursement ready in the private family ledger? And more importantly, why has your full-ride academic scholarship to Yale University been sitting in a deferred status for 3 consecutive cycles, while the university sends monthly inquiries to this primary email address regarding your failure to matriculate?" The silence that followed her question did not just fall. It hit the room like a physical weight, a crushing atmospheric pressure that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the lungs of everyone present. I felt the world tilt on its axis, the familiar walls of the dining room suddenly looking like the cheap cardboard sets of a failed play, as the words, "full ride scholarship to Yale," echoed in my mind like a rhythmic thrumming of the Heidelberg press. My mother, who had been reaching for a $140 Le Creuset stoneware serving dish filled with glazed carrots, experienced a momentary, total neurological collapse. Her grip failed, and the heavy ceramic vessel plummeted to the reclaimed oak floor, where it shattered into exactly 12 jagged, uneven pieces with a sound like a gunshot. the carrots scattered across the rug like orange debris in a disaster zone, but no one moved to clean them up because all eyes were locked on the screen of Brooke's laptop, which was currently broadcasting the digital evidence of a grand-scale betrayal. My father's face, usually a mask of smug arrogance, drained of color until he was the shade of unprinted vellum, his hand trembling so violently that the Opus One sloshed over the rim of his glass and stained the white linen tablecloth like a fresh wound. Brooke continued to scroll, her confusion rapidly hardening into the righteous indignation of a woman who realized she was marrying into a family of parasites. She started reading aloud, her voice steady and clinical, detailing the digital footprints of the forged high school failure notices that had been created on my father's work computer in July of my 18th year, the same month they told me I was a liability who would never amount to anything. She pointed out the automated alerts from the Yale admissions office, dated every August for the last 3 years, asking why the Sterling scholar had not yet claimed her housing assignment or registered for her advanced mechanical engineering seminars. I felt a cold electric shock of realization surge through my spine, a sensation of my brain finally snapping back into place after years of being forced into a shape that didn't fit. I wasn't the slow, remedial child they had spent $42,000 on for tutors who were actually just paid actors or family friends helping to keep the charade alive. I was a Yale-caliber engineer whose intellect was so formidable that my parents had to commit multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft just to keep me in the basement running their machinery for free. The $85,000 Vanguard Trust, which my grandmother had set aside for my education, had remained untouched only because they needed me to believe I was broke and beholden to them for the debt of my existence. The technical reality of their crime was staggering. They hadn't just lied to me, they had systematically dismantled my identity to protect their profit margins, turning a brilliant young woman into a high-functioning serf. I looked at the 12 jagged pieces of the Le Creuset dish on the floor, noticing how the light reflected off the glazed surface, and I realized that each shard represented a year of my life they had tried to steal, or a lie they had told to keep the Heidelberg Speedmaster humming. Tyler sat there, his mouth agape, his white Audi A5 keys sitting on the table like a symbol of the stolen wealth he had been enjoying at the cost of my sanity, while Brooke looked at him with a dawning horror that suggested their engagement was likely as broken as the stoneware on the floor. The contrast between the remedial Abigail they had invented and the Yale engineer Brooke had just discovered was so vast that the air in the room seemed to vibrate with the friction of the two realities colliding. I looked at my father, who was now leaning heavily against the sideboard, his bespoke suit suddenly looking ill-fitting and pathetic. And I saw not a patriarch, but a desperate, small-minded man who was terrified of a 21-year-old girl. The silence persisted, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, until I finally stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound that felt like a declaration of war. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended 3 years ago in the toner-choked air of the workshop. Instead, I walked over to Brooke and looked down at the screen, seeing the official Yale University seal on the deferred admission letter, the blue and white colors vivid and accusing. I saw the Vanguard account balance, $85,412.63, a sum that would have been more than enough to change my life 1,000 times over while I was cycling to the thrift store on a rusted trek bike to buy used flannels. My mother began to make a low, whimpering sound, a pathetic attempt to regain the narrative, but the evidence was too clinical, too digital, and too undeniable for her theatricality to save her this time. The financial audit trail Brooke had uncovered was the map of my liberation, and as I stood there in the center of the room, the smell of the rosemary-crusted meat now nauseating, I felt the phantom weight of the basement press finally lift from my shoulders. They had spent years telling me I was limited, that my mind couldn't grasp the complexities of higher education, while they secretly managed a scholarship and a trust fund that proved I was among the elite of my generation. The $42,000 they claimed I owed them for remedial tutoring was likely just another layer of the fraud, a way to justify the $0 they paid me for 62 hours of master-level printing work every week. I looked at Brooke, who was still staring at me with that profound, haunting pity, and I realized that she had just handed me the keys to my own life. The deferred status of my scholarship was a ticking time bomb for my parents, because it meant the university still expected me, and the Vanguard Trust was legally mine the moment I turned 18, regardless of the lies they had fed me. I was not a liability. I was a Sterling. And for the first time in 21 years, I understood that the only thing limited in this house was the time my parents had left before the full weight of their crimes came crashing down upon them. I reached down and picked up the largest shard of the broken Le Creuset dish, the edge sharp enough to draw blood, and I placed it on the table in front of my father, a silent promise that the period of debt restructuring was officially over, and the era of total, devastating repayment had just begun. I was going to Yale, and I was going to take every cent of that $85,000 with me, leaving them with nothing but the ink-stained ghosts of the daughter they thought they could break. I sat in the oppressive, absolute silence of my 120-square-foot basement room that night, the air thick with the lingering scent of industrial cleaning solvent and the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the furnace that had served as the white noise of my imprisonment for 38 months. There were no hysterics, no frantic pacing, and certainly no tears to blur my vision as I sat on the edge of my thin, narrow mattress, staring with a clinical, detached intensity at a blossoming dark gray mold stain on the yellowed drywall, a stain that looked remarkably like a Rorschach test of my own wasted potential. I reached for a battered yellow legal pad I had salvaged from the printing shop's discard pile and a fine-point black Uniball Vision Elite pen, the kind of professional stationery my father insisted on using for his executive meetings while I was relegated to using scraps. I drew a cold, surgical binary table down the center of the first page, dividing my existence into two mutually exclusive realities that could no longer occupy the same physical space. On the left side, I scrawled the heading, "The Narrative," in a jagged, aggressive script, and on the right side, I wrote the ledger in block capitals that felt as heavy as the cast-iron frame of the Heidelberg press downstairs. Under the narrative, I listed the lies that had been fed to me like slow-acting poison since I turned 18, that I was cognitively limited, that my high school transcripts were a record of failure, that I was a financial liability to the family, and that my labor was a form of charitable debt restructuring for $42,000 in imaginary remedial tutoring. Under the ledger, I began to calculate the cold, hard mathematics of my exploitation with the precision of the mechanical engineer I was apparently destined to be, noting that at a conservative market rate of $18.50 per hour for a skilled offset press operator in the Fairfield County area, my 62-hour work weeks over 156 weeks totaled over $178,000 in uninvoiced stolen labor. I realized with a clarity that felt like a localized ice age in my chest that my parents, Robert and Susan Sterling, did not see a daughter when they looked at me. They saw a high-yield, low-maintenance biological asset that required nothing but a basement cell and 3 meals of leftovers to generate 6 figures of annual gross profit. They saw an $85,000 Vanguard Education Trust not as my gateway to a future at Yale, but as a private, high-interest ATM that they were likely skimming or using as collateral for the very business loans Brooke had mentioned at the dinner table. The betrayal was not emotional in that moment. It was structural, a systematic dismantling of a human being's identity to serve the bottom line of Sterling and Sons printing. And as I stared at the 2 columns on the yellow paper, the phantom weight of their charity dissolved into a thin, pathetic vapor. I didn't need a tearful apology. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation over the broken shards of a Le Creuset dish, and I certainly didn't need their permission to exist anymore because I finally understood that the person they had spent 3 years trying to bury was the only reason their gilded lifestyle hadn't already collapsed under the weight of its own fraud. What I needed was an exit strategy designed with the surgical intent of causing maximum casualty to their carefully curated reputation in Greenwich, a social standing they valued more than the blood in their veins or the daughter in their basement. I began to map out the technical specifications of their downfall, noting every industrial safety violation I had witnessed in the print shop, from the lack of proper ventilation for the chemical wash-ups to the bypassed safety sensors on the 1998 Speedmaster that my father refused to repair to save on maintenance costs. I thought about the forged high school failure notice, a document that likely constituted wire fraud if it had been transmitted electronically, and the deferred Yale scholarship that stood as a 3-year record of identity theft and educational sabotage. My mind, which they had spent years telling me was slow and incapable of higher-order thinking, began to fire with a high-voltage intensity, connecting the dots between their corporate tax filings and the private education trust they had effectively hijacked. I looked around the cramped room, at the rusted 2009 Trek bicycle leaning against the peeling baseboard and the stack of thrifted flannels that represented the sum total of my worldly possessions, and I felt a sense of power that was far more dangerous than anger. I was the one who knew the lubrication schedules for the machinery, the one who held the mix formulas for the custom Pantone inks, and the one who understood the delicate pressure balance of the impression cylinders. Without me, the production schedule for the Sterling and Sons anniversary gala would grind to a catastrophic halt within 48 hours. I calculated the exact cost of the paper stock currently sitting in the basement, thousands of dollars of premium Mohawk eggshell and Strathmore wove, and realized that a single accidental adjustment to the fountain solution could ruin an entire week's worth of high-margin corporate orders. But a simple act of sabotage was too small for the scale of their crime. I wanted the world to see the balance sheet of my life, just as Brooke had seen it on her MacBook Pro, in cold, unyielding digital ink that no amount of social maneuvering could erase. The mold stain on the wall seemed to pulse in time with the furnace, a reminder of the rot that had taken hold in this house long before I was born. And I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that I was the one who was going to perform the demolition. I began to write a list of names on the back of the legal pad: the Yale admissions office, the Vanguard Compliance Department, the Connecticut Department of Labor, and every high-end client whose invitations I had hand-printed while being told I was a failure. I envisioned the look on my mother's face when the garden club realized that the unfortunate daughter they pitied was actually a national merit scholar being held in state-mandated conditions of forced labor. I thought of my brother Tyler in his $3,200 a month Chicago loft, realizing that his white Audi A5 was fueled by the sweat of a sister he treated like a servant, and I felt a surge of cold, clinical joy. Every minute I had spent in this basement, every ounce of toner dust I had inhaled, and every shriek of the 5:30 a.m. alarm was now a line item in a debt that was coming due with interest that would bankrupt them emotionally, socially, and legally. I sat there until the clock on my bedside table ticked past 3 a.m., the yellow legal pad now filled with a blueprint for a counter-offensive that was as precise as a CAD drawing, my handwriting never wavering as I detailed the steps of my departure. I would not leave in the middle of the night like a fugitive. I would walk out the front door in the full light of day, but only after I had ensured that the limited Abigail they had invented was replaced by the Abigail who was about to dismantle their empire sheet by sheet. The silence of the basement was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a laboratory where I was carefully mixing the chemicals for a reaction that would burn through the Sterling name until there was nothing left but the truth. As the furnace kicked off and the house grew still, I lay back on my bed, the yellow pad clutched to my chest, and for the first time in 38 months, I didn't feel like a liability or a ghost. I felt like the smartest person in a house that was built on a foundation of lies that I was about to crack wide open. The ledger was balanced, the narrative was dead, and as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the tiny, high-set window of my basement cell, I realized that the exit strategy didn't just include my physical departure. It included the total reclamation of the $85,000 they had tried to steal from my future. I would take the 2009 Trek bicycle one last time, not to the thrift store to buy more flannels, but to the local library where the high-speed internet and the public record databases would provide the final components of the tactical data I needed to finish them. My father's 12-year-old Macallan Scotch and my mother's Le Creuset stoneware were the trappings of a life they had bought with my time, and as I closed my eyes for a brief, disciplined hour of sleep, I knew that by this time next week, the only thing they would be invoicing me for was the cost of their own spectacular public ruin. The Abigail Sterling they knew was a fiction of their own making, a shadow designed to operate a Heidelberg press in the dark. But the real Abigail Sterling was an engineer of consequences, and the first lesson in their new curriculum was going to be the most expensive mistake of their lives. The transition from the damp, ozone-heavy basement to the sterile, sharp-edged reality of a forensic accountant's office was the first time in 3 years I felt like I was breathing air that wasn't contaminated by the Sterling family lies. Monday morning arrived with a cold, unrelenting gray light at exactly 9 a.m. sharp as I sat in the high-backed leather chair of Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for financial demolition preceded him and whose workspace smelled of expensive cedar wood, polished mahogany, and the acidic, lingering scent of cold espresso. I am Abigail Sterling, and to get across the threshold of this office in downtown Stamford, I had utilized a $1,500 cash retainer that I had meticulously borrowed from the petty cash tin I had managed with clinical precision for over 38 months at Sterling & Sons Printing. My father always assumed I was too cognitively limited to understand the flow of currency, leaving me in charge of the small-scale cash transactions because he believed I lacked the imagination to ever misappropriate a single cent. But he had failed to account for the fact that a master press operator understands exactly how to keep a machine running while the gears are shifting in secret. Marcus Thorne did not look like a savior. He looked like a predator in a charcoal-gray Tom Ford suit, his eyes scanning the preliminary digital files I had extracted from my father's unsecured office computer with the detached intensity of a surgeon performing a biopsy on a malignant tumor. As he began to cross-reference the family's private ledger against the public filings of the Vanguard Education Trust and the Sterling corporate tax returns, the room became a silent laboratory where the narrative of my supposed failure was systematically dismantled by the cold, unyielding logic of the ledger. He hit pay dirt within the first 45 minutes, his dual-monitor setup flashing with the blue light of 4,122 pages of incriminating data that represented the true blueprint of my parents' betrayal. The documents revealed a staggering, calculated scheme of identity theft and financial pillaging that went far beyond mere exploitation of my labor, showing that Robert and Susan Sterling had forged my electronic signature on 14 separate federal documents, including tax returns and educational grant applications that I never knew existed. They hadn't just stolen my time or my education. They had systematically siphoned $214,000 from the estate of my late grandmother, Eleanor, a fund that was legally mandated for my welfare and professional development. While I was wearing $4 thrifted flannels and riding a rusted 2009 Trek bicycle through the rain, my parents were using my inheritance as a private treasury to fund my brother Tyler's $3,200 a month industrial loft in Chicago and his obscene $1,200 a night bottle service at high-end clubs in Miami. The digital trail was a map of their greed, showing wire transfers from the Vanguard account directly into the financing for Tyler's 2024 Ibis White Audi A5 Sportback, a car that was essentially bought with the fragments of my stolen future. Thorne leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silence of the office, and pointed to a specific line item on a 2022 IRS form where my forged signature looked eerily similar to my father's distinctive, arrogant scrawl. This is not just a family dispute, Abigail. This is a multi-year campaign of wire fraud and grand larceny that carries significant federal implications if the authorities decide to pursue the evidentiary chain we are currently uncovering, he said, his voice as dry as the parchment paper I used for high-end wedding invitations. I watched as he compiled the data into a single massive evidentiary file, the progress bar on his screen moving with a rhythmic certainty that reminded me of the Heidelberg Press. Except this time, the machine was printing the truth instead of my parents' propaganda. I took the entire evidentiary chain, every single PDF of a forged signature, every unauthorized wire transfer receipt, and every deferred Yale scholarship notification, and I dumped them onto an encrypted 64-gigabyte Kingston Iron Key drive that felt heavy and cold in my ink-stained hand. This small piece of hardware was the weapon I had been building in the dark, a digital bomb that contained the total destruction of the Sterling name and the absolute reclamation of the life they tried to convince me I was too stupid to lead. The technicality of their crimes was breathtaking in its arrogance. They had relied entirely on the belief that I would never look up from the ink fountain rollers long enough to question why the remedial tutoring they claimed to pay for never actually occurred. Thorne's analysis showed that the $42,000 they used as leverage to keep me in the basement was actually a series of circular payments made to a shell corporation owned by one of my father's golf partners, a blatant money laundering tactic designed to create a paper trail of my supposed inadequacy while they pocketed the cash. I felt a sense of clinical detachment as the numbers scrolled by, the six-figure siphoning from my grandmother's estate, the unauthorized use of my Social Security number to secure business credit lines, and the systematic redirection of my Yale financial aid package into the Sterling & Sons operational account. The liability they had created was actually their most lucrative revenue stream, a 21-year-old girl who was inadvertently paying for the very suits her father wore while he belittled her. As I left Thorne's office at 11:30 a.m., the Kingston Drive tucked into the hidden pocket of my flannel shirt, I felt a strange, cold calm that was more powerful than any anger I had ever known. I walked through the streets of Stamford, past the professionals in their crisp shirts and the luxury cars idling at the stoplights, and I realized that I was no longer the ghost in the basement or the remedial child they had invented to serve their ego. I was the architect of their upcoming bankruptcy, a woman who had been trained by their own cruelty to notice every mechanical flaw and every financial inconsistency. I thought of the 2024 sapphire blue BMW M4 sitting in our driveway in Greenwich and the way my mother looked in her $4,000 necklace, and I knew that within 72 hours, those symbols of their stolen prosperity would be as worthless as the 12 pieces of shattered Le Creuset on our dining room floor. The 64-gigabyte drive represented the end of the narrative. It was the ledger made flesh, and as I mounted my rusted Trek bicycle to ride back to the house that was no longer my home, I felt the wind on my face and understood that the only thing I was truly, cognitively limited in was my ability to continue being a victim of people who valued a German-engineered car more than their own flesh and blood. Every revolution of the bicycle pedals felt like a countdown to the moment I would plug that drive into the main terminal at Sterling & Sons and watch the entire facade crumble in a flurry of digital red ink. My parents had spent 3 years teaching me how to operate a press that created beautiful things for other people, but they had failed to realize that they were also teaching me how to dismantle the very system that held me captive. I was Abigail Sterling, a National Merit Scholar and a future Yale engineer, and the $214,000 they had siphoned from my past was about to become the down payment on a future they could no longer imagine, let alone control. I looked at the gray sky over the Long Island Sound and smiled, a sharp, cold expression that would have terrified my father if he had been there to see it, because the most dangerous person in the world is the one who has been told they are nothing and then discovers they are actually the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. I was going home one last time, not to load the paper or wash the rollers, but to ensure that when the Sterling & Sons anniversary gala began, the only thing on display would be the clinical forensic evidence of their total moral and financial collapse, printed in the very ink I had spent 38 months scrubbing from my soul. The calendar had finally bled out to the night of the Sterling & Sons Founders Gala. a 2-week stretch of time that I had navigated with the cold, mechanical precision of the Heidelberg press I had once been a slave to, and the venue was the Pinecrest Country Club in Greenwich, a sprawling estate where the air was thick with the scent of freshly mown grass, expensive florals, and the suffocating perfume of old money that had never been earned by the hands wearing the diamonds. At exactly 7:45 p.m., the ballroom was illuminated by the amber glow of 3 massive Swarovski crystal chandeliers, casting shimmering reflections across the polished parquet floor, where 55 high-net-worth guests, including local council members and hedge fund titans, were tucked into their seats for a $200 a plate surf and turf dinner featuring butter-poached Maine lobster and Wagyu filet mignon. My father, Robert Sterling, stood at the mahogany podium at the front of the room, looking every bit the successful patriarch in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than the annual property taxes on our basement. And he was currently mid-speech, his voice booming with a nauseating, practiced sincerity as he lectured the silent room on the virtues of family legacy, the sanctity of business integrity, and the weight of the Sterling name. I stood in the heavy, gold-trimmed shadows of the foyer for a moment, feeling the weight of the Kingston Drive in my pocket and the sharp edges of the 55 manila envelopes I carried in a professional leather portfolio, each one meticulously sealed with a drop of crimson-red wax that looked like a drop of fresh blood against the tan paper. I was no longer the girl in the $4 thrifted flannels with ink stained into the cuticles of her fingers. Instead, I walked into the light of the ballroom wearing a $600 charcoal wool suit from Theory that I had purchased with the very first paycheck from a secret freelance technical printing consult I had performed for a rival firm in Stamford during my final week of employment at the house. The fabric felt cool and structured against my skin, a physical manifestation of the armor I had built in the dark, and as the heels of my polished black pumps clicked against the marble threshold, the sound cut through my father's monologue like a mechanical failure alarm in a silent factory. I wasn't there for the vintage Dom Perignon flowing into the etched crystal flutes or the 4-tier vanilla bean cake topped with hand-spun sugar filigree that sat on a pedestal like a monument to vanity. I was there to deliver the final invoice for 38 months of a life they had tried to erase. Robert's face, which had been flushed with the pride of a man who believed his lies were impenetrable, turned the distinct, sickly shade of curdled heavy cream the very second his eyes locked onto mine, his mouth hanging slightly open as the word integrity died on his tongue like a withered leaf. My mother, Susan, who was seated at the head table next to a local senator, froze with a silver fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the daughter she had dismissed as cognitively limited, now standing in the center of her most prestigious social event with the posture of a reigning queen. I did not wait for an invitation, and I certainly did not ask for permission as I began to move from table to table with a slow, deliberate grace, placing one red wax-sealed manila envelope next to each gold-rimmed charger plate, ensuring that every prominent guest in the room was holding a physical copy of the evidentiary chain Marcus Thorne and I had compiled. Inside each envelope was a high-resolution color printout of the forged high school failure notice, a copy of the deferred Yale scholarship letter, and a forensic summary of the $214,000 siphoned from my grandmother's estate to pay for Tyler's lifestyle and the very dinner they were currently eating. The silence that followed my progress through the room was not just quiet. It was a vacuum, a total cessation of the Greenwich social machinery as the high-net-worth guests began to break the wax seals with curiosity that quickly morphed into audible gasps of horror and hushed, frantic whispers. I reached the head table last, where my brother Tyler was sitting with his head down, refusing to look at me because he knew that the white Audi A5 he drove was now effectively listed as Exhibit A in a grand larceny case, and I placed the final 3 envelopes directly in front of my parents and the senator. Robert's hand was trembling so violently that he had to grip the sides of the podium to keep from collapsing. his charcoal suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume as the people he had spent decades impressing began to stand up, their faces twisted in disgust as they read the details of how he had imprisoned his own daughter in a basement to subsidize his business. The contrast between the remedial Abigail they had laughed about over bridge games and the woman who had just executed a flawless, multi-point reputational execution was so stark that it felt like a physical heat in the room. I looked my father directly in the eyes, seeing the hollow, terrified man beneath the Brioni wool, and I realized that the limited mind he had tried to suppress was the only thing in this room that was actually functioning with total, unyielding clarity. The gala was no longer a celebration of the Sterling legacy. It was a wake for a reputation that had been built on the theft of a child's future, and as the senator stood up and walked away from the table without saying a word, the 4-tier vanilla bean cake seemed to tilt, a metaphor for the entire Sterling empire beginning to slide into the abyss. My mother tried to speak, her voice a thin, pathetic warble that attempted to claim this was all a misunderstanding, but the 4,122 pages of incriminating data were already being discussed in every corner of the room, and the digital copies were already being uploaded to the local news tip lines and the Yale Alumni Board via the automated script I had set to trigger at 8:15 p.m. I had calculated the maximum casualty for their reputation down to the second, and as I watched the Pinecrest Country Club staff begin to hover awkwardly at the edges of the room, unsure of whether to serve the dessert or call the police, I felt a sense of completion that no amount of money could ever buy. The debt was not just being repaid, it was being liquidated in the most public forum possible, and the $85,000 trust fund that was sitting in a Vanguard account was already being transferred to a private account in my name, a process I had finalized that morning with a court order and Marcus Thorne's assistance. I stood there for a final, silent minute, breathing in the scent of the expensive lilies and the ozone of the cooling chandeliers, and I realized that the basement had not been a cage so much as it had been a forge, and the person who walked out of it was someone they were never equipped to handle. Family, I thought as I turned my back on the wreckage of their social life and began to walk toward the exit, is not a name on a printing press or a seat at a country club gala. Family is the people who don't require you to be small so they can feel big. As I stepped out into the cool Connecticut night, leaving the envelopes and the curdled cream face of my father behind me, the rhythmic thud of the Heidelberg press finally stopped echoing in my mind, replaced by the quiet, steady hum of a future at Yale that was no longer deferred, but was now, finally, undeniably mine. I walked toward the parking lot, past the rows of Range Rovers and Mercedes-Benzes, and I didn't look back to see if they were following me because I knew they were already trapped in the prison of their own making, a cell built of wax seals and forensic accounting that no amount of scotch or bespoke tailoring could ever unlock. My name is Abigail Sterling. I am 21 years old, and tonight I didn't just walk out of a gala. I walked out of a 3-year ghost story and into the first day of a life where the only ink on my hands would be the kind used to sign my own destiny. The gala would end in a flurry of legal threats and social excommunication, the vanilla bean cake would go uneaten, and the Sterling name would become a cautionary tale whispered in the hallowed halls of Greenwich. But for me, it was simply the closing of a ledger that had finally, through blood and ink and sheer force of will, been brought to a perfect, devastating balance. I got into the car I had arranged, a simple, reliable black sedan that didn't need to be a status symbol because I already knew exactly what I was worth. And as the gates of the Pinecrest Country Club disappeared in the rearview mirror, I understood that the greatest asset the Sterling family ever had was the one they were too stupid to keep, and the cost of their ignorance was going to be the only thing they ever truly had to pay for in full. The silence in the Pinecrest Country Club ballroom was no longer the polite quiet of an attentive audience. It was the suffocating, electrified stillness that precedes a structural collapse, and I stood at the epicenter of it with a composure that felt like tempered steel. My father, Robert Sterling, was still clutching the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles white against the dark wood and his breathing shallow, as I stepped forward into the spill of the spotlight, my charcoal wool suit catching the crystalline glints from the chandeliers above. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice projected with a clinical resonance that was entirely devoid of the trembling or the cognitive limitation he had spent 21 years trying to manufacture. "I believe there is a brief and rather essential addendum required for this evening's lecture on the Sterling family legacy and the sanctity of our shared integrity." I did not wait for his permission or for the room to recover its collective breath as I began the final distribution of the 55 manila envelopes, moving with a fluid, mechanical efficiency that I had perfected over thousands of hours on the printing floor, making sure that each guest, the very people who formed the social and financial bedrock of my parents' existence, received their own personal dossier of the Sterling betrayal. Each envelope was a forensic explosion, containing a high-resolution, bank-certified copy of my original Yale University acceptance letter, alongside the crudely forged high school dropout notice my mother had used to gaslight me into 3 years of unpaid labor. I ensured that the top document in the stack was a series of verified wire transfer receipts, highlighted in yellow, which showed exactly $8,400 being moved from my grandmother's educational trust directly into the merchant account of an authorized Rolex dealer to purchase the 2024 Submariner date currently glinting on my brother Tyler's wrist. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral. Mrs. Gable, the town's most prominent philanthropist and a woman who had once publicly pitied my developmental delays, let out a sharp, strangled gasp as her half-eaten cocktail shrimp slipped from her silver fork and hit the polished parquet floor with a wet, pathetic thud. The rustle of paper filled the room as the guests began to scan the bank-certified evidence, their faces shifting from confusion to a profound, searing disgust that signaled the absolute end of the Sterling social era in Greenwich. My mother, Susan, finally broke her paralysis and lunged toward me, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and a desperate, claws-out need to maintain the facade, her hand reaching out to grab my arm as if she could physically drag the truth back into the basement. I pivoted away from her touch with a sharp, calculated grace that left her stumbling against the head table, her $4,000 Van Cleef necklace clashing discordantly against the fine china as I turned back to the podium to deliver the final technical specifications of their ruin. "Do not touch me, Susan," I said, the coldness of my tone acting as a physical barrier that froze her in place. "And do not think for a single second that this ends with a private conversation or a quiet apology behind closed doors." I looked directly at my father, whose face had moved past the shade of curdled cream into a ghostly, translucent gray that made him look every bit the hollow fraud he was, and I watched as he realized that the limited daughter he had exploited was the one who had choreographed the total destruction of his life. "The detectives from the Greenwich Police Department and investigators from the state's attorney's office are currently waiting in the foyer, Robert," I stated, my voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd like a guillotine blade through silk, "and I have already provided them with the digital originals of the 14 federal documents where you forged my electronic signature to secure business credit lines and siphon my inheritance." I watched his eyes dart toward the double doors of the ballroom, the realization finally sinking in that in this jurisdiction, identity theft and grand larceny involving a trust fund of this magnitude carry a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a state penitentiary, a sentence that no amount of social standing or bespoke tailoring could ever mitigate. The technical reality of their crimes was now a matter of public record, and as the first 2 officers in plain clothes stepped into the periphery of the amber light, the gilded cage they had built around me finally, irrevocably shattered. Tyler, who had been the primary beneficiary of my stolen years, sat paralyzed as guests at his own table pushed their chairs back in a collective act of social distancing, looking at him as if he were a common pickpocket rather than the heir to a printing empire. I felt no joy in the moment, only a profound sense of equilibrium, a feeling that the ledger was finally balanced and the narrative was being written by the person who had actually lived it. I looked at the 55 envelopes scattered across the tables, their red wax seals looking like points of cauterized truth against the white linen, and I knew that by tomorrow morning, the Sterling name would be synonymous with the most calculated family fraud in the history of the county. The $85,000 that had been siphoned for Tyler's loft and his Rolex and his bottle service was now a weight that would drag them into the very basement they had tried to keep me in, while I was already mentally calculating the credits I would need to take to catch up on the 3 years of engineering school I had been denied. The silence of the room was now punctuated by the low, authoritative voices of the detectives moving toward the head table, their presence a cold, metallic contrast to the luxury of the founder's gala. My father tried to speak, perhaps to offer one last lie or to appeal to the legacy he had just finished praising, but the words wouldn't come. He was a man who had traded his soul for a Heidelberg press and a BMW, and now he was finding out exactly how little those things were worth in a court of law. I turned my back on the podium, on the 4-tier vanilla bean cake that was now a monument to a collapsed dynasty, and I walked toward the exit with the Kingston Drive tucked safely in my pocket and my head held higher than it had ever been in the dark of the workshop. The air in the ballroom felt heavy with the scent of Wagyu beef and impending incarceration, but as I stepped through the doors and into the foyer, the air changed, becoming crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of the coming autumn. The exit strategy was complete, the casualty list was absolute, and as I walked past the detectives who were preparing to read my parents their rights, I didn't feel like a victim or a liability. I felt like a national merit scholar who had just passed her final, most difficult exam with honors. I was Abigail Sterling, and for 38 months, I had been the silent engine of their prosperity. But tonight, I had become the architect of their justice, and the only thing I was taking with me from this house was the one thing they could never actually own: my mind. As I stepped out into the night and walked toward the car that would take me away from Greenwich forever, I heard the distant, muffled sound of my mother's first real scream of realization. But I didn't stop, and I didn't look back. I had a full-ride scholarship to Yale to claim, a $214,000 restitution case to manage, and a life to start that didn't involve the smell of industrial ozone or the weight of a ghost's expectations. The Sterling and Sons Founders Gala was over. The press was silent, and for the first time in 21 years, the only person I had to be grateful to was myself. Currently, I occupy a 600-square-foot studio apartment in the heart of New Haven, Connecticut, a space that is clinical, quiet, and 100% mine in a way that the basement in Greenwich could never be. The walls are painted a crisp, architectural white that reflects the morning light cutting across my drafting table, and the air here smells of nothing but fresh coffee, expensive parchment, and the profound, heavy scent of freedom. My name is Abigail Sterling, and the life I lead now is the direct result of a calculated surgical demolition of a dynasty that was built on the bones of my potential. It has been exactly 4 months since the Sterling and Sons Anniversary Gala collapsed into a scene of forensic accounting and police intervention, and the fallout was as absolute as the mechanical failure of a press run without oil. Sterling and Sons Printing filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation a mere 16 weeks after the red wax-sealed envelopes hit the tables at the Pinecrest Country Club, as the scandal nuked their prestigious client list in less than 72 hours. The high-net-worth individuals and corporate entities that once provided the $1.2 million in annual revenue vanished like ink in a rainstorm, unwilling to have their brand associated with a man who had effectively enslaved his own daughter to subsidize his son's Miami bottle service and luxury watches. The legal repercussions have been just as clinical and unyielding as the evidence I provided on that 64-gigabyte Kingston Drive. My father, Robert Sterling, the man who once stood at the top of the stairs swirling 12-year-old Macallan, is currently serving 36 months of supervised federal probation after taking a plea deal for multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. As part of his sentencing, His wages and the remaining liquidated assets of the printing company are being legally garnished for the full $214,000 in restitution owed to my grandmother's estate, a debt he will be paying back for the rest of his natural life. My mother, Susan, has moved into a cramped two-bedroom rental in a far less prestigious part of the state, her $4,000 Van Cleef necklace having been sold at a significant loss to cover the initial legal retainers for a defense that ultimately failed. The most poetic moment of the entire collapse occurred on a Tuesday morning at precisely 10:45 a.m., when Tyler's ibis white Audi A5 Sportback was repossessed from the driveway of his Chicago loft while he watched from the window, a vehicle bought with the fragments of my stolen education finally being reclaimed by the very financial systems my parents tried to manipulate. I am now a sophomore at Yale University, pursuing a degree in mechanical engineering with a focus on industrial automation, and I currently maintain a perfect 4.0 grade point average that serves as a daily, silent refutation of the cognitive limitations my father claimed defined me. My days are no longer measured by the 5:30 a.m. shriek of an alarm clock for unpaid labor, but by the rigorous, intellectually stimulating schedule of advanced thermodynamics and fluid mechanics. I sit in lecture halls that cost $60,000 a year in tuition, costs fully covered by the scholarship I finally claimed and the trust fund that is now under my sole legal control. The rusted 2009 Trek bicycle has been replaced by a reliable, modest commuter car that I purchased with my own verified earnings, and the thrifted flannels have been traded for a wardrobe that reflects a woman who is no longer hiding in the shadows of an offset press. My digital life is equally curated. I have exactly 0 unread messages from my biological family, as I have blocked every avenue of communication from the people who viewed my existence as a line item in a corporate ledger rather than a human life. The silence from them is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, a quiet that allows me to focus on the intricate mathematics of my future instead of the gaslighting of my past. I often walk through the Yale campus, past the Gothic architecture and the bustling student centers, and I realize that the technical skills I honed in that basement, the ability to understand complex machinery, the patience to manage high-pressure systems, and the forensic attention to detail, were the very tools I needed to dismantle the Sterling name. They thought they were training a servant to operate a Heidelberg Speedmaster, but they were actually training the engineer who would eventually shut them down. The $85,000 in the Vanguard Trust was never just money. It was the key to a door they tried to keep locked, and the moment I turned that key, the entire structure of their lives came crashing down with a mechanical finality that was as satisfying as a perfectly aligned print run. My studio apartment in New Haven is filled with textbooks, engineering schematics, and a single, small, framed photograph of my grandmother, Eleanor, the only person who saw my worth before I was old enough to claim it for myself. There is no mold on these walls, no scent of ozone or damp concrete, and no one stands at the top of the stairs to remind me of my supposed failures. I have realized that family isn't the DNA you share with people who would sell your future for a Rolex. Family is the integrity you hold within yourself and the community you build once you stop being grateful for the crumbs of your own life. The limited Abigail they tried to create died in that basement, and the woman who replaced her is someone who understands that the most important ledger in life is the one that tracks your own self-respect. The bankruptcy of Sterling and Sons was not just a financial event, it was a moral reckoning that stripped away the bespoke suits and the country club memberships until there was nothing left but the truth of their greed. Every time I check my bank account and see the restitution payments appearing as a steady, monthly reminder of my father's debt, I am reminded that justice is a slow-moving press, but once it starts, it prints with absolute clarity. I am no longer a liability or a ghost. I am a student, an engineer, and a woman who knows exactly what it costs to save your own life from the people who were supposed to protect it. The 38 months of stolen time can never be fully recovered, but the 36 months of my father's probation serve as a sufficient down payment on the peace I have finally found in this quiet clinical studio. The future I am building now is one where I am the sole architect of my successes and the only person who decides what I am capable of achieving. As I sit at my desk, looking over the course syllabus for my next semester and listening to the soft hum of the city outside my window, I know that I would do it all again. The secret freelance jobs, the forensic audit, the public execution at the gala, because the price of my freedom was high, but the cost of staying in that basement would have been my soul. My name is Abigail Sterling. I am 21 years old, and I have finally learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tells you that you are limited is to prove that you are the only one who can see where the limits actually end. The Sterling legacy is a pile of bankruptcy filings and repossessed luxury cars, but my legacy is just beginning, written in the clear, unshakable ink of a life that I finally own.